In the heart of a remote village nestled between dense forests and rugged hills, the wind carried more than just the scent of earth and pine. It carried secrets, stories, and whispers of a woman who had dared to speak the truth. She was known among the villagers as a force of nature, a voice that shattered the silence of complacency and hypocrisy. Her words were sharp, often cutting into the core of those who wielded power unjustly, challenging customs and exposing lies. But such bravery comes at a cost. The village itself was old, with traditions as deep-rooted as the ancient trees that surrounded it. Life here moved slowly, governed by unspoken rules and the fear of upsetting the fragile balance. The woman's voice, though vital to some, was a threat to others who preferred the quiet of ignorance and obedience. Tensions had been simmering for months, fueled by her relentless defiance and the growing unease among those she challenged. One night, under a sky veiled with heavy clouds, the village elders and a group of influential men decided that her voice must be silenced once and for all. They met in secret, away from prying eyes, and crafted a cruel plan. To bury her alive within the walls of the old stone house at the village edge, an ancient dwelling said to be cursed and long abandoned. The act was not only physical but symbolic. To trap her words, her spirit, within the cold, unyielding walls, hoping to bury the truth alongside her. The night of her silencing was heavy with dread. The villagers who had once admired her turned away, fearful of association and the wrath of those in power. The women wept quietly behind closed doors, while the men carried out the grim task. Her cries echoed faintly as earth and stones closed over the secret tomb where she was entombed alive, or so they believed. But the village soon learned that silencing a voice like hers was not so simple. Strange things began to happen. Whispers drifted through cracks in the walls, murmurs that seemed to crawl through the very fabric of the houses. Doors that had been locked tight creaked open on their own, and shadows danced just beyond the candlelight's reach. The air grew thick with an unseen presence, heavy with sorrow and righteous fury. No one dared speak openly about what they heard, but the rumor spread like wildfire. Some said it was the woman's restless spirit, refusing to be contained, seeking justice beyond death. Others believed it was a curse upon the village for their cruelty and silence. Children reported hearing her voice at night, soft but insistent, calling out names and revealing secrets long buried. The haunting whispers became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that truth cannot be buried so easily. The walls that were meant to silence her instead became conduits for her voice, an eternal echo that challenged the living and unsettled the dead. The villagers found themselves caught in a web of fear and guilt, unsure whether the haunting was punishment or a plea for justice. As days turned to weeks, the atmosphere grew heavier. The village, once peaceful and indifferent, became a place of restless nights and hushed conversations. People began to question their roles in her fate and the cost of their silence. The woman's story, though buried beneath stone and earth, lived on in the whispers that crawled through the walls, an unyielding testament to courage and the power of the spoken word. Thus begins the tale of a silenced woman whose voice transcended death, weaving through the fabric of a village forever changed by the haunting echoes of her truth. Before the night that sealed her fate beneath cold stones and heavy earth, the woman was a beacon of unrelenting courage, a voice that pierced through the thick veil of silence and fear suffocating her village. Her name had been whispered in awe and fear, a symbol of defiance against corruption and injustice that had gripped the community for generations. From an early age, she had sensed the cracks beneath the village's calm surface, the undercurrents of greed, deception, and cruelty that many preferred to ignore. While others accepted the status quo with quiet resignation, she refused to look away. Her sharp mind and fierce spirit made her a natural leader among those who dared to hope for change. The village leaders were a tight-knit circle, wielding power through fear, favoritism, and ancient customs designed to maintain control. They enriched themselves while the poor labored, silencing dissent with threats and intimidation. Secret deals were made behind closed doors, land stolen, voices bought, and laws twisted to suit the powerful. The woman saw through it all. Her resistance began subtly, pointing out injustices at village meetings, questioning decisions that disadvantaged the vulnerable, and advocating for fairness in land disputes. Her words stirred uneasy murmurs among the elders but also sparked hope in the hearts of the oppressed. She became a voice for the voiceless, a fierce defender of those who had no one else to turn to. But the village leaders were not willing to share their grip on power. They branded her a troublemaker, a witch, and a threat to the village's harmony. Rumors were spread to discredit her. Whispers that she consorted with spirits, that she sought to overthrow the natural order. Yet she remained undeterred, her resolve only strengthening as the hostility grew. She uncovered secrets that could topple the village's power structure. Proof of bribes accepted, alliances forged with corrupt outsiders, and abuses committed in the name of tradition. Each revelation sent ripples of fear through the ruling class, who responded with harsher measures to silence her. Threats turned to violence, and soon she found herself isolated, her closest allies forced into silence or exile. Despite the growing danger, she continued her crusade. Her courage inspired a small but determined group of followers who believed in justice and change. Together they held clandestine meetings in the forest, sharing news and planning ways to protect their rights. The woman's voice became a rallying cry, echoing through the darkened village streets where fear had once reigned. Her defiance struck at the heart of a deeply ingrained system. She challenged not only corrupt leaders but also traditions that kept women and the poor subjugated. She demanded education for all children, fair treatment in disputes, and an end to secret punishments meted out without trial. Her vision was radical, a future where truth and fairness were not luxuries but rights. Yet for all her strength, she was vulnerable to the tides of fear and envy that churned beneath the village's surface. The more she spoke, the louder the calls for her silence grew. Her enemies saw her not just as a political threat but as a symbol of chaos that could unravel their carefully maintained order. The night they decided to bury her alive was meant to be a final silencing, an act of brutal justice to protect their secrets and crush any spark of rebellion. But in trying to extinguish her voice, they underestimated the power of truth and the spirit it kindles. Her life was a testament to the price of speaking out in a world ruled by fear. She bore the weight of betrayal from those she once trusted, yet never lost the fire that made her a force to be reckoned with. Her story became a warning and an inspiration, proof that even in the darkest moments, courage can ignite change. Through her relentless fight against corruption and oppression, she not only exposed the village's sins but also planted the seeds of hope. Though her body was hidden beneath the walls, her voice lived on, carried by the whispers that haunted the village, reminding all who listened that truth, once spoken, can never be buried. The conspiracy to silence the woman was woven tightly into the very fabric of the village's power structure, a shadowy network of individuals who had everything to lose if her voice continued to rise. They moved carefully, knowing that open violence would spark outrage, but silence was essential to maintain their hold on the village and its people. Unraveling the web of conspiracy reveals not only who wanted her silenced, but why, and how far they were willing to go to bury the truth. At the heart of the conspiracy was the village chief, a man whose iron grip on leadership was threatened by the woman's growing influence. Though outwardly charismatic and respected, behind closed doors he was ruthless, driven by fear of losing his position and the wealth that came with it. For years he had quietly enriched himself by exploiting village lands and resources, funneling profits to his inner circle. The woman's calls for reform jeopardized this secret prosperity. If her accusations gained traction, it could mean the end of his reign and the exposure of his greed. Beside the chief stood his closest advisor, an elder steeped in tradition but secretly anxious about the changing tides. This advisor wielded influence through religious and cultural authority, using superstition and fear of the unknown to manipulate the villagers. He saw the woman's defiance as a direct challenge to his control over the village's moral compass. Her push for progress, education, and questioning of old customs threatened to unravel the very foundation of his power. He believed that silencing her was not just necessary, but a divine duty to protect the village's sanctity. A wealthy landowner whose estates expanded through shady deals and intimidation was another key figure in the plot. He feared that the woman's revelations about land theft and corruption would inspire others to demand justice, potentially dismantling his empire. His influence was less visible but no less deadly. He used bribes and threats to keep others in line, ensuring loyalty through fear and greed. The woman's growing support among the common folk was an existential threat to his control, and he was willing to do whatever it took to extinguish it. Among the conspirators was also a trusted village healer, a figure respected for their knowledge of herbs and spirits. Though outwardly kind, they secretly resented the woman's challenge to their authority and the healer's monopoly on healing and spiritual guidance. The woman's insistence on fairness and questioning old beliefs undermined the healer's standing, threatening their livelihood and status. They played a subtle role in the conspiracy, spreading rumors and manipulating superstitions to isolate the woman further. These conspirators, despite their differences, shared a common fear: the loss of power. Their methods, though varied, converged on one goal: to silence the woman before her words could spark rebellion. They used intimidation, isolation, and psychological torment, whispering lies and turning neighbors against her. They capitalized on the village's superstitions, labeling her a witch or cursed soul to justify harsh measures. The fear they instilled made even her closest allies hesitate, fracturing her support network. Tensions among the conspirators simmered beneath their facade of unity. Some wanted a quick, brutal end. Others favored subtle manipulation to avoid suspicion. The chief pushed for a decisive act to crush dissent, while others feared the consequences of such blatant cruelty. This division created a dangerous volatility, where paranoia and suspicion gnawed at their alliances. As the plot advanced, small cracks appeared. Secrets leaked, and villagers began to question the sudden hostility toward the woman. Rumors of conspiracy spread quietly, carried on hushed conversations and worried glances. The conspirators' carefully constructed lies began to unravel, exposing the ugly truths they sought to hide. The night of her silencing was the culmination of these fears and tensions, a desperate attempt to restore control. But in their blind pursuit of silence, the conspirators failed to understand the power of the woman's voice. Their act of brutality ignited a haunting unrest that would ripple through the village for years. In the end, the conspiracy revealed not just the individuals who wanted her silent, but the deep-rooted corruption and fear that held the village captive. Their secrets, once buried, began to claw their way to the surface, threatening to shatter the fragile peace and forcing the village to confront the darkness within. ChatGPT said. The night they silenced her was not one the village would ever forget, though for years they tried to pretend it had never happened. It began with a heavy sky. Clouds clung low to the hills like grieving widows, and the air was thick with the smell of approaching rain, but it never came. The wind moved strangely that evening, twisting down narrow footpaths, rattling the bones of old trees, as if nature itself was whispering a warning too late. The village lay quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was tension drawn tight as the string of a hunter's bow. She had felt it coming. Days before, her dreams had turned cold, filled with soil and silence. The villagers no longer met her eyes. Even children, once eager to hear her stories and bold truths, now shuffled away when she passed. Doors that once welcomed her now closed softly in her face. Her voice, once a torch in the village's darkness, had become a threat, a spark they feared would ignite everything they'd built their power upon. She knew she was alone, yet her spine didn't bend. Her shoulders remained straight. In her silence, there was defiance. She walked through the village that night as she always had, cloak rustling against the wind, gaze unwavering. But the air smelled of endings. They came for her just after dusk, when the village square had emptied, and the shadows grew long and sharp. 5 of them, faces masked not in cloth but in fear. The chief's men silent as wolves. She did not scream when they took her. She watched each of them with eyes that saw too much, eyes that knew secrets they had buried in their hearts long before they came to bury her in the ground. They did not take her far. Just beyond the old well, past the yam fields, there was a dry patch of earth no one had tilled in years. Once, long ago, it had been a place for offerings, before the elders declared such practices dangerous. Now the ground there cracked like skin too long in the sun. They had dug the hole before they even took her, deep, narrow enough for one. They forced her to kneel beside it, her breath steady even as the first fist struck her jaw. No words were exchanged. They didn't want to hear her speak. Her voice had always been too sharp, too honest. She bled quietly, the soil drinking her blood like it had waited for it. One of them, young, trembling, hesitated. She looked up at him. He froze under her gaze. She didn't plead. She didn't ask for mercy. Instead, she whispered something only he heard. His eyes widened. He stepped back. The others didn't notice, too consumed by the rush of control, the illusion of righteousness. With rough hands they pushed her in. The fall was not far, but the pain in her ribs stole her breath. The sky above was small from where she lay. And then came the soil. They shoveled it fast as though afraid they might change their minds. Each handful hit her body with the weight of betrayal. Her fingers clenched. Her chest burned. Her mouth filled with earth. Still she did not cry out. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was the moon, a perfect white eye watching everything. When they left, they didn't speak. They scattered like roaches at dawn, their hands trembling, their hearts racing. None of them returned to the village by the main road. None dared speak of what they had done. But the earth did not keep their secret. That night the wind returned, fierce and cold. It howled against the walls of the village like a wounded animal. Children woke screaming. Lamps flickered and fires died without reason. Animals panicked in their pens. And in the wind, if one listened closely, there was a sound not of storm or tree or beast, but of breath. Of a whisper. The grave they dug was meant to hold silence, but something else had taken root instead. By morning, the patch of ground where they buried her was untouched. No sign of digging. No loose soil. As if the earth had sealed itself perfectly. And that frightened the men more than any ghost. Because they had expected something: evidence, closure. A mound, a marker, a stain. Instead there was nothing. As if she had never existed. But she had. And now, her absence rang louder than her presence ever had. That same morning, a child claimed she heard a woman's voice in the walls of her hut, whispering her name in a tongue she didn't know. A farmer's tools rusted overnight, though they had been oiled and sharpened just days before. The healer's herbs withered in their jars. The chief found his drinking water thick with ash. And the wind, always the wind, would curl around their ears at night and whisper not words but guilt. They told themselves it was grief or fear, or the imagination of guilty men. But every night the air grew colder. Every night the whispers came closer. And sometimes the young man who had hesitated would wake in a sweat, her final words ringing in his mind. Not a curse. Not a threat. Just a promise: I will not stay silent. It was not the end. It was the beginning. It began with the children. In the weeks following the woman's disappearance, the little ones, those too young to understand politics or power, started to whisper things their parents didn't understand. The wall is talking again, a boy muttered one morning as his mother dressed him for the farm. Another girl, barely 4, refused to sleep in her room, insisting that a woman kept singing to her from under the floorboards. At first, the adults laughed nervously, brushing it off as dreams or stories overheard from gossiping elders. But the laughter didn't last. One by one, the children's stories grew more detailed, more unnerving. She says she's cold, one child whispered to the village midwife while staring into the hearth. She wants her voice back, said another, eyes wide with an understanding far beyond their years. The children, unburdened by guilt or denial, spoke freely of the woman whose name their parents dared not utter. The midwife, shaken by the strange patterns in the children's words, quietly approached the healer. But the healer, once proud and steady, was no longer herself. Her hands trembled constantly now, and she muttered prayers even when no one was listening. She claimed her sleep had been stolen. Each night, she said, the wind hissed through the cracks in her hut and curled beneath her blanket, cold and angry. I hear her, she whispered one morning after a sleepless night. She walks the rooms of my home. Her footsteps never touch the ground. By the third week, the whispers were no longer confined to the innocent mouths of children. The first adult to admit hearing something was old Muba, the potter whose house lay near the yam fields. One night, as he shaped clay in silence, a cold gust of wind blew through his workshop, snuffing out his lantern. In the thick darkness, he heard it, words not spoken but breathed, threading through the air like smoke. They came from the very walls, curling beneath his ears, warm and soft yet filled with an ancient ache. You buried the truth, it said, but truth does not die. He fled his hut that night, barefoot and bleeding, claiming he'd seen the soil in his floor crack open like a mouth. Still, the elders cautioned restraint. These are tricks of the mind, the chief declared at the next village meeting. Fear's playing games with your ears. But even as he spoke, his eyes darted to the shadows, and his voice lacked the conviction it once held. The chief's own compound, grand and guarded, was no longer safe from the whispers. His wives began reporting strange occurrences, mirrors fogging on their own, their names whispered from empty corners, a presence brushing past their beds when no one was there. The youngest wife, once lively, stopped speaking altogether. She sat on the floor near the window each night, staring out at the yam fields, lips trembling as if whispering back to something unseen. Words spread quickly, carried not by tongues but by glances, tremors, silences. Doors were bolted earlier each evening. Fires were built higher and longer, though the weather was warm. People began sleeping in groups, sharing huts to ward off the creeping sense of isolation. But no matter how many bodies filled the room, the wind still found its way in, and with it, the whispers. At first they were just sounds, barely audible murmurs, soft like leaves brushing stone. But soon they grew more distinct. Names, accusations, regrets, secrets. The villagers swore they heard things only the dead woman could have known. A man heard her whisper the location of a second family he kept hidden in another village. A woman, weeping alone by her hearth, heard the voice recall her betrayal, how she had turned away from the silenced one when her support was needed most. These were not stories shared openly, they were private horrors, known only to the individuals they haunted. But the whispers weren't the only sign. Footsteps began to echo in the night, soft and deliberate, pacing through corridors that hadn't seen life in weeks. They came from attics, from basements, from kitchens. Always slow, as if someone were walking in thought, not aimlessly but with purpose. Doors creaked open and closed with no wind. Water jars tipped over without cause. Ash from cooking fires sometimes formed patterns, spirals, handprints, the rough outline of a woman's face. The chief, though resolute in public, began drinking heavily behind closed doors. His guards reported him waking in the night, shouting at the wind, threatening it, pleading with it. One morning he appeared with scratches down his arms, claiming a wild animal had broken into his hut. But no claw marks were found on the walls. Only dust, thick and cold, settled on his bed like a second blanket. The elder advisor who once championed the burial began losing his voice. At first it was hoarseness, then coughs, then silence. No illness could be found in him. His throat remained untouched, yet he could no longer speak above a whisper. Some said it was the woman stealing her voice back, one breath at a time. Fear infected the village like a sickness. Harvests began to fail without reason. Goats gave birth to stillborn kids. The river that once ran clear turned cloudy for 3 days straight. No rainfall. No explanation. People spoke less, walked faster, avoided eye contact. They performed blessings, burned herbs, drew chalk patterns at their doorways to keep spirits away. But nothing worked. Because it wasn't a spirit. It was her. Not a ghost, not a figment, but her truth, her essence, her breath, woven into the fabric of the village she had tried to save. The wind was not wind anymore. It carried memory. It carried judgment. It carried pain that refused to lie still in the soil. The conspirators grew more paranoid than the rest. The wealthy landowner began hiring strangers from outside the village to stand guard around his home. He claimed someone was watching him from the trees. Every night, he left fresh food at his doorstep, muttering apologies to the dark. But his crops withered and his fields cracked. The healer stopped treating others. Her home was filled with smoke and silence. She painted her face with ashes every morning, whispering to herself in a language no one remembered. Some said she had begun speaking to the wind as if it were her twin. As denial gave way to dread, the villagers began to ask the one question they had tried so hard to avoid. Had they buried an innocent woman? Or worse, had they buried the truth alive? The whispers never answered directly. But they never stopped. Each night they grew louder, closer. Not angry, not screaming, just constant. A sound like breath behind every wall, reminding the village of what it had done. Of what it had tried to forget. And of what would not rest. They tried to burn the house once. It was old, made of cracked clay and wood that groaned with every breeze, nestled near the edge of the village where the trees grew too close and the air smelled like wet bark even on dry days. Long before she ever stepped into its walls, the villagers had whispered about the place. It had a reputation, a certain heaviness in the air that made the elders mutter charms under their breath as they walked past. Children were told never to play near it, and birds never nested in its rafters. Even the wind that rustled through its loose windows came in slow and quiet, as though wary of what it might disturb inside. But when she moved in, when the woman with the sharp voice and braver tongue took the house as her own, the whispers around it grew louder. Some believed she didn't choose the house. That it chose her. Others said she was drawn there by the voices already buried in the walls, that the ghosts of old truths guided her feet. The elders called it foolishness, but they avoided the house all the same, making excuses whenever she invited them to speak or listen. That place had history, they said. A bitter kind of memory that stuck to the walls like old smoke. It was the same house, decades earlier, where a midwife vanished during a season of strange stillbirths. The same house where, long ago, a boy was found dead with no marks on his body, and his mother's hair turned white overnight. Stories piled up like bones, each generation adding their own layer of fear, their own warning. And when the woman took up residence, people said she was playing with fate. They weren't wrong. She lived there alone, with no husband, no child, just a few carved statues and a shelf of worn scrolls. People claimed she lit fires at odd hours and sang to them, songs not heard in the village for generations. They said the smoke from her hearth smelled different, rich, like spiced soil. And sometimes, when night fell heavy and the village quieted, you could hear her talking, to someone or something. Not mad talk, not rambling. Steady, intentional conversation. As though the walls answered back. When she died, when the men came and dragged her from her own home under the guise of tradition and order, they chose to bury her in the same house. Beneath the floor, deep in the packed red earth, no ceremony, no stone, just a silence so tight it pressed on the chest of anyone who entered afterward. They told the village she had gone away, that she left of her own accord, but no one believed it. And the house never let them forget. It started subtly, just as the rest of the village began to fray. The new occupants, strangers from the neighboring region, lasted 3 nights before fleeing in the dark, barefoot and wild-eyed. They wouldn't speak of what they'd seen, only that the house wasn't quiet. That it spoke in voices not their own. After that, no one dared claim it. The door hung crooked, flapping open with the wind, and the windows filled with dust and cobwebs like gauze across a wound. But the house breathed. Anyone who stepped too close felt it, the sharp drop in temperature, the way the air seemed to pulse beneath the skin. No matter the time of day, a shadow hung over its threshold. Birds circled above it but never landed. The trees nearest the back wall began to twist in odd directions, branches curving away like they too were trying to leave. And then came the stains. Dark patches, shaped like hands or mouths, began to appear on the inner walls. No matter how many times they were scrubbed, they returned. Once, during a foolish bet, a group of teenage boys entered the house and tried to paint over them with white chalk. By morning, the chalk had turned black, and the boys refused to speak to each other again. The village called it cursed. They said the house was built on broken oaths, on truths buried alive. That every stone, every beam had absorbed her pain. And more than pain, memory. The kind of memory that couldn't fade, that refused to die with her. She had lived in that house with her truth. And now her truth lived in it without her. People began to report dreams, ones they couldn't shake even when awake. Dreams of standing in that room, of a low hum vibrating in their chests, of walls breathing in and out like lungs. Some said they saw her, only a glimpse, a figure in the corner, eyes glowing faintly like coals under ash. Always watching. Always waiting. Some said the house wanted more. It wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. Those who conspired to bury her found their paths leading them past it again and again, even when they didn't mean to. Their feet would falter, their minds slip, until they stood before it, trembling with memory. One of the guards, one who helped carry her into the earth, was found sitting on the steps one morning, hands muddy and torn. When asked why he was there, he only said, "She called me to finish the burial. But the earth won't take her." Soon the villagers decided to destroy it. They gathered with torches, drums, and chants, hoping that flame would do what time could not. They set the roof alight first, watching it curl and blacken. The fire roared, climbing like an angry spirit. But the walls did not fall. The fire burned for hours, longer than any house fire should. And when it died, when the smoke lifted and the embers cooled, the house remained. Charred, blackened, but standing. The stains on the walls returned. The whispers resumed. And now the house was louder. The village never tried again. They let the house rot, standing like a tombstone at the edge of their lives. Children were warned with even more fear. Drummers avoided its rhythm. No crops grew near it. And at night, when the wind passed through the village, it always seemed to circle the house, pausing just long enough to sigh through its hollow bones, carrying her voice with it. She was part of it now. The house didn't just remember her pain, it became her voice, her eyes, her breath. Every whisper that curled from its corners was a piece of her. Every shadow that flitted across its cracked windows was a memory unburied. She had been silenced in life. In death, the walls gave her 1,000 mouths. And the village had to live with that. No matter how much they tried to move on, to forget, to deny, they couldn't escape her. Because her truth had teeth. And it was buried in a place that could never forget. The house waited still. It waited for those who lied. For those who stood silent. For those who turned their backs. Because walls, once they learn to speak, do not unlearn. They echo again and again. And her whispers, they would crawl forever. It began with the chickens. One morning, the birds in the northern part of the village refused to leave their coops. They clucked wildly, feathers matted with sweat and dust, their eyes wide and unblinking. When a farmer opened the wooden hatch to let them out, one of them flew directly into his face, scratching his cheek and drawing blood. That night, his wife heard whispers beneath the floorboards, like someone crawling under the house, muttering old riddles in a voice she had once heard at a gathering, a voice long silenced. Whispers weren't rare anymore. They had started softly, as if the wind had developed a voice and lingered longer near certain windows. But now they came from drains, from under beds, from behind closed cupboards. And what they said wasn't random, it was remembering. Naming. The woman's voice had become a slow, scraping presence that coiled around the village's throat. The people who had nothing to do with her death, those who had kept their distance or even sympathized with her, felt fear first. Not because they thought she would harm them, but because she hadn't forgotten. And if she remembered everything, she might tell everything. So they watched. They whispered in corners. They stopped trusting their neighbors. Even greetings became strained. A wave wasn't just a wave, it was a question. A smile, a veiled accusation. Who among us helped? Who knew and stayed silent? Children began wetting their beds. Dogs howled at nothing. Fields grew strangely, rows of maize curled in upon themselves, like the soil wanted to keep its secrets. And through it all, the elders remained silent. Too silent. That silence was the most terrifying sound of all. Because those who led the burial, those who planned her disappearance, those who stood in the room and watched her be lowered into the earth beneath her own house, they were the ones the whispers lingered near longest. The villagers noticed it. They began to suspect. Old Madeku, who used to laugh the loudest at her bold words, now never left his hut. One morning he was found scribbling something in the mud with his fingers. Names. 3 of them were dead. 1 was his. He wouldn't speak after that. Only rocked back and forth mouthing, "She knows? She saw us." Soon after, the head priest fell ill. They called it a fever at first. But when his wife opened the temple at dawn, she found him standing naked before the altar, speaking in a voice not his own. It was her voice. Raspy, low but unmistakable. He pointed at the temple walls and cried out, "This clay remembers what you buried. You covered my mouth with earth. Now the wind will wear it away." By midday the priest was dead. No wounds. No sign of illness. Just a face frozen in something between terror and awe. That's when the real fear started. People began to suspect each other, not only of involvement in her death, but of harboring her ghost. A whisper near your home could mean you were next. A shadow under your door could mean guilt. A woman lost her mind after hearing her name spoken from inside her cooking pot. A man moved away with his children saying only, "If she speaks to my son, he'll know the truth." And the truth was exactly what the village feared. Because she had known too much. In life, she had exposed the chieftain's false taxes, uncovered stolen offerings in the shrine, and stood in the village square telling the wives their bruises were not traditions but chains. She had dug too deep, spoken too loudly, and for that she was buried. But now her voice was louder than ever. So the elders called a meeting. They did not meet in the village square nor the temple. They chose an old granary outside the village, thinking it might be far enough from her whispers. It wasn't. 20 men and women gathered, sitting in a circle, candles between them. Their faces were tired, pale, and damp with sweat. They spoke in low tones, arguing over what to do. "She's not gone," one of them said. "She walks now in the breath of the house. She rides the wind. Maybe if we confess." "No. Confession makes her stronger." "Then what? Burn the house again?" They had no plan. Only fear. And more than fear, dread. Because one among them had already broken. A man named Tum, a stonemason, had gone missing days earlier. He had been one of the men who laid the false floor in her house, sealing her beneath it. His wife found a note beneath his bed. It read, "I heard her whisper in the dust. She told me my son dreams of fire. I go now to unbury her truth." They never found his body. Only his tools, left in a perfect line outside her house. After the meeting, some villagers turned on each other. Accusations flew. One woman slapped her neighbor in the market, yelling, "You were there. You held the spade." The neighbor denied it, but within days a group of youths stoned her hut in the night. Others left charms outside her door, twigs twisted into symbols meant to ward off spirits. It didn't help. Her child went missing 3 nights later. All they found was a single word carved into the kitchen wall: "Listen." The paranoia seeped into every breath of the village. Children were forbidden to speak after sunset. The young were taught to watch their parents for signs of possession. The old started keeping fires burning all night, believing that flames would drown out the whispers. And every so often someone would vanish. Or fall into silence. Or start speaking in riddles only she had once spoken. Then came the wall scratchings. They started appearing in homes far from hers. Small lines at first, then full sentences, scratched into wood, into stone, into flesh. One message read, "You covered me in silence. But silence is only waiting." Another, "The house is only one of many. I live now in every wall." In response, some villagers began sealing their walls with mud and ash. One family even burned down their own home and fled. They never made it to the next town. A shepherd found them days later, their bodies arranged in a circle, mouths filled with soil. The village was unraveling. They had not buried a woman. They had buried a storm. And now it howled through every crack they left behind. Some still tried to reason with the voice. An old herbalist left offerings at her door, roots, herbs, a small locket of hair. She whispered apologies, promises. The next morning she found her herb garden uprooted, and every root tied into knots shaped like no known symbols. That night her breath left her in sleep. No struggle, no marks. Just silence. The guilt-ridden few tried to leave. But the road out twisted strangely, leading them back to the village again and again. One boy said the trees whispered her name backward like a chant. Another claimed the wind pushed against them, refusing to let them go. They realized then, it wasn't only the house. The whole land had become part of her. Wherever there was clay, where she had walked, where she had spoken, there was memory. And in that memory she lived. There was no escape from memory. Not for those who had tried to erase it. And the greatest fear now wasn't just her presence, but her justice. Because it came slowly, intimately, with names, with stories, with truths. They had hoped her silence would be the end. But instead, her silence became a seed. And it had grown into a storm of voices, a forest of memories, a village of echoes. And so the people remained trapped. Not by walls but by guilt. Not by death but by the haunting weight of all they had done, and all she still remembered. Desperation has a scent. It's a bitter, sour tang that clings to breath and sweat. By the time the villagers began seeking help, that scent hung over the entire place like mist. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had grown bolder, louder, sometimes coming in full sentences that rattled through the air even in daylight. Crops refused to grow straight. People heard their own names echo in places no one else was near. One woman woke up with soil packed under her fingernails, though she swore she hadn't left her bed. Something was coming, something old, unrelenting, and far beyond their grasp. So they turned outward. The first was a traveling priest from a distant hill shrine, known for casting out unquiet spirits. His name was Mikiro, and his eyes were always closed, even when he spoke. He claimed he could hear the voices of the dead like songs on the wind. They brought him into the village at dusk, and he walked to the woman's house barefoot. He didn't knock. He placed his hand on the door and simply said, "You are not gone." The villagers waited as he lit incense and placed 5 small clay bowls in the 4 corners of the house and one at the center. In each, he poured oil and whispered words older than the village itself. Then he sat cross-legged on the floor and chanted into the bowls. The oil boiled. The walls shook. And for a moment there was silence. But then, from beneath the floorboards came a single word, whispered so loudly the window panes cracked. "Liar." Mikiro rose slowly. His face was pale, lips trembling. "She is not a ghost," he said. "She is something else. Something, choosing." That night he left the village without looking back. Days later, his caravan was found overturned, his body curled in a riverbed. The clay bowls floated around him, unbroken. Panic returned with fury. Next came a group of forest shamans, sisters known as the Daughters of Bark and Bone. They arrived without invitation, their eyes painted black and mouths stitched with temporary thread until ritual began. They set up camp on the edge of the village, burning strange leaves and singing to the trees. The villagers watched as the sisters moved like mist, never in direct light, never lingering too long in one place. On the 3rd night they entered the woman's house. No one followed. What happened inside remains a mystery. But the next morning the house exhaled. Not metaphorically. The entire building expanded with a low groan and released a breath of wind that carried ashes and dust in all directions. It was enough to strip paint, knock over baskets, and blow out every fire in the village. When the wind settled, the sisters were gone. Their campsite was untouched. But within their tent, someone found a note etched into bark. "She does not wish to be cast out. She wishes to be heard." The village fell into chaos. Arguments broke out in the marketplace. Some demanded the house be destroyed. Others said that would only anger her further. One man, certain this was all a test from the ancestors, began gathering people to pray to the mountain spirits instead. A woman from the far side of the village claimed she had heard the whispers speak of forgiveness, if they only returned something buried with her. "What?" someone shouted. What did they bury with her? The woman didn't know. But the idea spread like wildfire. Soon villagers were digging near the house, clawing through the earth like animals, searching for some object. A ring, a scroll, a lock of hair, that might stop the whispers. They found nothing. But each night the whispers grew colder. Angrier. Her voice no longer just repeated names or riddles. She began saying things she couldn't have known. Childhood secrets, buried shames, dreams no one had spoken aloud. One elder confessed he had once loved her in secret. Another admitted he knew she was alive when they buried her, but said nothing out of fear. A third tried to take his own life, but even then the wind whispered, "Not yet." They needed more help. So, reluctantly, they summoned a scholar from the city, an outsider who studied folklore and old hauntings. His name was Ebo, and he brought with him journals, relics, and a device that caught sound on spinning discs. He didn't believe in spirits, but he believed in trauma, in memory trapped in places, in what he called psychic echoes. He stayed in the woman's house for 3 nights, recording everything. On the first night he heard humming. On the second he heard scratching and muttering, words that matched entries in her old journals. On the third he heard his own voice played back to him, but twisted, reversed, and made to confess things he had never said aloud. Ebo left the next morning, pale and shaking. He offered no conclusions. But he left one of his discs behind, still spinning. It never stopped. Even without electricity, it kept turning, playing fragments of her voice, disjointed, angry, grieving. Her pain trapped in a loop. Her truths broken and repeated. After that, no one came willingly. Rumors spread that the village was cursed. Traders stopped arriving. Letters went unanswered. The village, once proud and busy, became a place of closed shutters and hurried footsteps. The haunted woman was no longer just a memory. She was a presence, a question no one could ignore. And still the villagers tried. They brought in offerings. They sacrificed goats and chickens. They tried music, dance, fasting. One desperate group tried to perform a binding ritual meant to trap her spirit in a sealed jar. When they opened the jar the next day, it was filled with dead wasps, and their own names scratched into the glass. Nothing worked. That's when the children began dreaming her dreams. A 6-year-old boy spoke of standing underground, hearing footsteps above, dirt falling into his mouth as he screamed with no air. A little girl began drawing pictures of a woman with stitches for lips and fire in her eyes. None of the children had known her. Yet they remembered her now as if she were part of them. It was no longer about haunting. It was inheritance. The final attempt came from a wandering monk, a man who claimed he could walk between worlds. He said he had crossed plains of bone, oceans of flame, and could reach into the realm where the dead lingered. He was tall, calm, and carried a single bell made of bone. He entered the house with no fear. The villagers waited. Hours passed. Then, as dusk bled into night, they heard the bell ringing. Not once, but over and over, fast and sharp like a scream made of metal. Then it stopped. They found the monk standing in the center of the house, bell in hand. His hair was white. His skin was cracked like dry earth. He looked 10 years older. He spoke only once. She cannot be silenced because she was never heard. You do not need a priest. You need to listen. Then he left. That was the final attempt. After that, the villagers stopped trying to chase her out. They boarded up the house, planted thorn bushes around it, told stories to the children about why they should never go near. But still the whispers came. They came not just from her house, but from every injustice buried deep in the village soil. She had become more than herself. She had become memory made flesh. She had become the reckoning. And no outsider could undo that. No ritual could erase a truth buried alive. Now, when the wind howls, the villagers close their doors and whisper apologies into the dark, hoping she hears. Hoping that someday she may choose mercy. But she whispers back. And she remembers. Always. At first, the whispers had no pattern. Just murmurs in the dark, name after name, fragments of thoughts that never seemed to finish. But as the nights passed, some villagers began to notice a rhythm, a repetition. Certain phrases returned, always in the same places, always in the same tone. Children heard lullabies distorted by rage. The elderly claimed the whispers carried the smell of blood and wet soil. The air itself pulsed with memory. Something was being said. And someone had to finally listen. It was the midwife, Amate, who first heard the complete sentence. She had stayed up late, kneeling before her hearth, speaking aloud to the air, confessing regrets and old fears as she ground healing herbs for a neighbor's sick daughter. The whispers had hovered nearby all evening, low and heavy like breath on the back of her neck. But when she paused and said, "I should have stopped them," the room grew still. And then the voice came, not just a whisper but a statement, deliberate and clear. "You saw the blood. You said nothing." Amma dropped her mortar. Shattered. But she did not run. She folded her hands and replied into the stillness, "Tell me what to do." There was no immediate answer. But the next day the whispers grew louder around her. And in the market square, someone found a scrap of cloth buried beneath the stone steps of the well, half burned, embroidered with the initials EN. The woman's name. It became clear then. The whispers were not hauntings. They were messages, clues, testimonies. And with that, the village began to listen. Pieces of the past emerged from walls, fields, and mouths long sealed by fear. A shepherd admitted he'd found her journal but hid it to protect his family. A mason confessed to helping brick up the chamber beneath the house, believing she was dead. A mother revealed a letter written by the woman, hidden among childhood toys, a letter naming names, detailing corruption, abuse, and stolen lands. The whispers did not threaten anymore, they directed. "Dig beneath the council tree," they said one night. When they did, they unearthed a rusted lockbox containing forged tax records and ledgers, proof of a decades-long embezzlement led by the village chief and 3 elders. The whispers said, "He watched." And a retired soldier admitted to witnessing her final confrontation with the council, watching in the shadows as she was dragged away. "She screamed until her voice broke," he whispered. "They told me to stay quiet, that it was justice." As truth spilled into light, a strange thing happened. The village air lightened. Crops began to rise straighter. The animals, once jittery, calmed. The children stopped dreaming of burial and began humming tunes that weren't sad. The spirit was unraveling her story, knot by knot, and the village, whether they wanted to or not, was being made to hold it. But some resisted. Chief Duro, old and hunched yet still stubborn, refused to speak. He barred his doors, prayed too loudly, and shouted at passers-by. But his name came up often in the whispers, too often. "He signed the order," they said. He demanded her silence. He buried her truths. One night, his home was engulfed in flame, not by fire but by wind. A violent, whirling funnel of ash and cold air tore through it like claws. Nothing caught fire, yet every paper inside was shredded, every secret exposed. In the ruins, villagers found a seal used to authenticate village edicts, and beneath it, a record of votes taken in secret. Her name appeared in bold, condemned by authority for sedition. The mask crumbled, and the whispers said, "Let them see." With the truth laid bare, a gathering was held, the first open village meeting since before her death. It wasn't called by the council but by the people. They gathered under the moonlight, beneath the tree whose roots once cradled false ledgers and guilt. They read her journal aloud. In it she had written not just about corruption but about vision. Hope. How the village could thrive if fairness replaced greed, if voices weren't crushed but heard. She spoke of a world where no woman would be punished for truth, where children could laugh without fear of inherited sins. The journal ended abruptly, a final entry marked with a smear of blood. "If they kill me, know this, it means I was right." A silence followed that reading, thicker than grief. Then, one by one, those who had remained silent began to speak. A teacher. A potter. A fisherwoman. A young man whose father had been one of the executioners. All of them came forward. All of them spoke the words they had buried like the woman's body. It was a mourning and a cleansing. A funeral after years of denial. And then something extraordinary happened. That night the whispers changed. They no longer echoed through cracks and creaks. They began to sing. Low and soft, like wind over reeds, a melody wound through the village. It had no words but everyone recognized it. It was the lullaby she used to sing as she walked by, the tune that once annoyed the elders and comforted the children. The wind sang it now, not with sorrow but with peace. But one task remained unfinished. Justice had been acknowledged, but not delivered. Chief Duro fled in the dead of night, taking with him what gold and influence he still had. But the wind followed him. Travelers along the road later told tales of a hunched man walking through dust storms that only followed him, how he aged with each step, how the wind whispered his name until he wept blood. He never reached the city. They found his body near the edge of the river, knees buried in mud, arms clawed toward the sky as if begging to be heard. And carved into the nearby stone, burned as though by fire, "Truth cannot drown." The village held no feast, no celebration. They returned to the woman's house, cleaned it, planted flowers where the door had once splintered. And finally they gave her a grave, a real one. Above it they placed a stone not with her name alone, but with her final words, etched and unflinching. "You cannot bury truth with silence." As they stood there, the wind passed gently through the trees. No words this time. No warnings. Just a hush like the end of a song. She was heard now. And at last she could rest. But her whispers had done more than unveil secrets. They had planted something in the village, a new way of speaking, of living. A fire beneath every tongue once scared to speak. Children were taught her story not as a ghost tale but as history. The wind still moved strangely through certain corners of the village, but it was no longer feared. It was respected, revered. And in quiet moments some claimed to feel a presence, not heavy, not angry, but watching, listening, waiting to remind them. That truth once whispered never dies. The air in the village changed, almost imperceptibly at first. No more sudden gusts sweeping through closed windows, no more voices humming through the floorboards. The wind had settled, not disappeared but resting. Like a watcher whose vigil had paused, satisfied if only for now. The grave where they laid her, beneath the whispering tree, became a quiet place of gathering. At first it was only the midwife, Amate, who sat there in silence every evening, folding her hands and muttering prayers or confessions no one else heard. But soon others joined. One by one, faces formerly tight with guilt or fear returned to the roots of that tree, not as penitents alone, but as people learning how to carry what they had once buried. There were no statues, no monuments beyond the etched stone with her words, yet her presence was everywhere. In the way people paused before speaking harshly. In the new laws discussed openly in the village square. In the children who now played around the tree without superstition, touching the earth and saying, "She was brave." The woman's family, once scattered and silenced by shame, returned in small waves. Her sister, Nima, arrived with a child on her hip and sorrow heavy in her voice. She had fled years before, threatened for defending the woman, forced to abandon both home and blood. When she stepped back into the village, older but unbowed, no one dared stop her. Her first act was to visit the grave. She knelt, not with wailing but with soft, rhythmic tapping of a carved drum. An old family tradition used to speak to the dead. "I heard you," she said. "I just couldn't answer then. But I'm here now." Her daughter, little Sira, began asking questions that only made the elders shift in discomfort. Why did they kill her? Didn't they know truth helps people? Will the wind be mad at us again? Nima didn't hush her. She let her ask. And the elders, one by one, began answering. It was not easy. Many still held their secrets like fragile eggs, delicate but uncracked. And there were those who refused to change, retreating into homes heavy with silence. But even they felt the pressure of the new winds, the weight of a story that had outlived the grave they had dug. A council was reformed, this time elected publicly, chosen by vote and voice. One seat was kept symbolically empty, with a carved chair bearing the woman's name, to remind all of what had been done in secret. It was decided that every season, the village would hold a day of voicing, where anyone, child or elder, stranger or kin, could speak openly in the square without fear of punishment. The first voicing was quiet. Then Amate stepped forward. Her hands shook, but her voice was clear. I saw them bind her hands. I saw her mouth bloodied. I did nothing. She bowed her head. I live with it. But I will not let her be forgotten. Others followed. Stories spilled from places no one had dared look. Tales of beatings, of silenced mothers, of lands taken without word or reason. Not all related to the woman directly, but each carried echoes of what had happened to her. And somehow, those echoes felt like an offering, a slow building of a monument made not of stone but of truth. Yet even as the village healed, there were reminders that peace came with a cost. Sometimes at dusk the wind would return, not angry but curious, like it was testing them, listening. A child's lie caught in a game, a merchant's unfair weight on the scale, and the breeze would whip through for a moment, unsettling baskets or rattling shutters. The people would stop. And remember, it wasn't fear, not anymore. It was respect. A new kind of silence, not forced but thoughtful. The woman's former home, long since abandoned, was restored by volunteers. Not as a residence but as a place of memory. Inside they kept the journal she had written, displayed for all to see, along with the burned cloth with her initials and a map showing the places where her whispers had been heard. They named it the House of the Wind, not to make her a myth, but to keep her message present. And still, sometimes at night, the whispers returned. Softer now. Different. They were not warnings or accusations anymore. They were fragments of poetry, of her thoughts once scribbled into corners of books. A voice is a flame, one whisper said. The truth walks even if its body sleeps. Children began to recite the whispers like old songs, passing them like secret treasures to new generations. But not all had forgiven. Not all had changed. One elder, once part of the council that condemned her, lived in isolation on the village's edge. He had refused to confess, even after the others had stepped forward or passed away. People left him alone, though some say the wind visited him more often than the rest. He began speaking to no one, talking into corners as if trying to drown out voices only he could hear. On the anniversary of her death, he was found outside his home, eyes open, hands clasped over his ears. The doctor said it was the heart. Others said it was justice. Carved into his wooden door were the words, "You knew." After that, even the most stubborn learned to listen. The village, once known for its order and obedience, slowly became known for something else: openness. People from neighboring communities came to learn how they had built a new council. Young women came to walk the tree-lined paths where a truth-teller had once stood, shoulders squared against the tide of fear. They told her story in many forms. As a parable. As a chant. As a bedtime tale where the wind carried the voice of a brave woman who could not be buried. And always, they ended the story with the same line: "She still listens, and so must we." One evening years later, a stranger arrived. She was a quiet, lean woman carrying only a pack and a walking stick. She stood at the grave long after the others had left, her eyes tracing the words carved into stone. A child passing by stopped and asked, "Do you know her?" The woman turned, smiled gently and said, "We all do. Or we should." The child tilted her head. "Are you afraid?" The woman looked at the wind moving through the branches, brushing over her skin like an old friend's hand. "No," she said. "I'm home." The child ran off, and the woman stood in the twilight, watching the wind dance across the graves and rooftops, watching how it stirred no fear, only reflection. Somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat began, soft, deliberate. Another ritual. Another memory kept alive. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through her hair. And for a moment, if you listened closely, you could hear it again. Not a whisper of rage or warning, but a breath. A sigh. Like the spirit of a woman finally at peace, knowing her voice had seeded forests in the minds of those who once tried to chop down her truth. And in that breath, a promise. That no matter how deep the grave, no matter how long the silence, truth always finds air. And it will speak.